And this is basically on the great culture clash of the age, which is can-do tech culture versus can't-do government culture. 100 years ago, this was the culture clash of the age then, is the modern leaders of America, who thought they were the business leaders of America, who thought mainly the politicians worked for them, were unhappy with the politicians because they needed them to do a lot of things so that so that their businesses could thrive. They needed public schools, they needed railroads, they needed electrification, they needed a lot of things from government for business to thrive. And business put enormous pressure on government to become a different kind of government, one that could do the things business needed for the country to thrive. So back then there was also a clash between can-do business culture and can't-do government culture as the America of a rural spoils system was adapting to the 20th century. So we now have the 21st century version of that problem, and to introduce it and moderate the panel, we have Philip K. Howard.
Thank you, Philip, and welcome to the last panel of the day. I thought that maybe what we would do is actually focus on solutions and pressure the panelists and also pressure you on ideas of how we move from a paralytic system that the other panelists have described towards a system of an operating system of government that can actually achieve the ends of the public without 30-year train construction projects and such. So we have three panelists who are excellent in this. Jennifer Palka, you've already met, who is one of the leading experts about bringing government into the modern world. In the Obama administration, she has a Substack called Eating Policy. It's one of the best written Substacks that I pay for.
Thank you, Philip.
In every prior life, Jennifer was a prosecutor, and she goes after red tape and unnecessary bureaucracy with a meanness and a viciousness that's truly refreshing.
To be clear, I'm not a lawyer and have never been a prosecutor.
Well, no, I didn't say in this life, in a prior life.
Okay.
Long ago, Josh Marcuse spent 10 years as in the Secretary of Defense office in the Pentagon, working on policy matters. He's now doing strategic initiatives in the public sector for Google. He can, because his job is to help solve problems, he will give us the answers on how to fix this. And finally, Dan Wong, whose new book, Breakneck, is a bestseller, deservedly so. It's incredibly entertainingly written. It shows how, in fact, Xi Jinping in his prior life was Robert Moses. And he simply makes arbitrary choices and everything gets built. And Dan has seen how the opposite public culture can sometimes, but not always, get things done properly. But before I go to them for their solutions, I'd like to challenge one assumption that hasn't been questioned in these public sessions yet, which is the assumption that the role of law is to prescribe or validate public choices. And I've written a book about it that was out front, but I've written 8 books about it. But the role of law in the public sector is actually to delineate authority and create checks and balances, as the Constitution does, to safeguard against abuses of authority. And so someone who has a job as an executive officer, as a police officer, as a teacher, or whatever, has to have room to use their judgment to do what's needed on the ground, just as whoever was talking about Army officers have delegated authority to do such. What happened after the 1960s, and Mark Dunkelman has written about this, and I've written about this, is that we not only changed our values, and when we woke up to the abuses of racism and pollution and other things, which we really needed to do, but we wanted to prevent any more abuses of authority in the future. And we actually changed the operating systems of government Before the 1970s, there was no such thing as a 1,000-page rule book. There was no such thing as 10-year processes to get a permit. President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Bill in 1956. It was 29 pages long. 10 years later, 21,000 miles of road had been built. Today, you could, well, the laws are much longer, they're much more prescriptive, and you couldn't get approval for a stretch of road in that period in some places. So I think that as we look towards solutions, we shouldn't simply look towards pruning the jungle or spring cleaning, which I'd like to talk about with you, because I think all of that is really important too. We also need to look at how decisions are made. How much room do officials and citizens have to use their judgment, use their common sense to make things happen and be accountable for how they do? Jennifer has really done an enormous amount of work in the IT sector and has really cataloged all the ways but you've also been involved in some solutions to fixing things in the IT sector with Recoding America and such. So what are your ideas about how we could go from where we are today towards a new narrative of an effective government?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me back up here. Appreciate it. I think my solution for the IT sector and for government broadly are essentially the same thing. I don't think there's a difference. We have locked ourselves into these very prescribed and very detailed procedures, as you say, that keep us from being able to do what everybody out there who is creating products and services that you love using does, which is test and learn their way to success. I'm looking at my colleague Andrew Greenway back there, who has taught me a bunch about this and done this with a lot of governments and shown some excellent examples. I wish we'd gotten him up here to talk about some of the ways that they have proven test and learn can really work in the UK and created much more scalable and robust benefit systems, for instance, because of it. So yes, I think you're right. It's not only that, but when you look at the problem of, say, pandemic unemployment insurance, failures in every single state, we accumulated huge backlogs. Everyone looked to COBOL, the programming language that is famously from 1959, as the culprit. But in fact, if you really want to look at, COBOL's actually not so bad. In fact, if you buy a plane ticket today, you're using, that system uses COBOL and it works quite well. But I would look more to the fact that the training manual, for instance, in the California Employment Development Department for a claims processor is something like 800 pages. In New Jersey, the labor commissioner was called up in front of the state legislature, as every labor commissioner was around the country, to be yelled at about their backlog of unemployment insurance claims, and again, yelled at about the COBOL in the system. And he pointed to the 7,119 pages of active UI regulations that govern, how his state was supposed to give out unemployment insurance. You just cannot make a system that is scalable and robust and can scale from, it had to go to 10 times as many claims or more in a couple of weeks if it's governed by that much detail.
Right.
And you cannot test and learn your way to something when you are wading through that volume of rules and regulations.
You can do stand-up comedy on government today. The granularity of the rules, I've sort of done it, is astonishing. There's a family apple orchard in upstate New York that New York Times did the story about a couple years ago. They were regulated by 17 different government departments. They had 13 clipboards in their office to keep it straight. Regulations from all over. One of the regulations required them to put a cloth over the cart when the apples were picked to protect the apples from bird droppings when they're going from the orchard to the barn to be washed. Those apples have been on the tree for 5 months, and the government does nothing to protect them. I mean, so you have this kind of what law professor Louis Jaffe called this vision of rationalized completeness, where every single possible event is detailed in a law or a procedure, and then you expect things to work. Well, in fact, the human brain doesn't have the capacity to deal with that. The human brain doesn't work that way. And so what's an example, maybe in the UK too? I mean, Francis, your friend probably worked with Francis Maud, who's a friend of mine.
Yes,
and,
he did.
And so Francis and I have talked about this over the years, Lord Maud. Give an example or two of how you can shift from this kind of micromanagement regime to a kind of a more practical regime.
Let me give 2 quick examples, and I will start with doing my best summary of the project that I've learned about, that Andrew wrote about, and I believe his paper is out there, The Radical How. They had a program called Universal Credit, which brought together quite a few benefit programs. Imagine in the U.S. if we tried to, put SNAP and unemployment insurance and various social services programs together in one program to avoid or at least reduce the negative effects of things like benefit cliffs and just make it simpler. You shouldn't have to apply for all these different programs. And Angela will just correct me as I get it somewhat wrong, but there was something like 10 years of this team trying to actually deliver a service to meet the new this new policy that they had decided on, and it just failed and failed and failed, and at actually very, very high cost. Lots and lots of money had gone into trying to create this system. They ended up rebooting it with a very small team. I think they kept a handful of people from the old team and added a few more. It was a deeply, deeply cross-disciplinary team. So you've got, in most cases, you've got developers, you've got product managers, you've got lawyers. They also had things like the actual people who would answer the phones on the team. So they're actually understanding the reality of what happens when you are getting this benefit and you have to call in, for a question. They have those people on the team. They have social workers on the team, but a very small number of them. And they started with just 1 block, or was it 2 blocks, Andrew? One square block in London, and said, we're going to roll this thing out in just 1 square block. And what they were able to do was actually test the policy and the implementation of the policy at the same time. And I hope Philip is still in the room, because yes, thank you. What he said earlier about if you're not actually doing the how, you're not actually doing the policy. This is a perfect example of that. They were able to iterate on the policy itself by testing it in the real world with real people. And there's much more to the story. I won't give the whole thing, but the end of it really is, then they were able to scale it up, and it was functional at the time that COVID hit, which was great, because as Andrew's called it was like the dog that didn't bark. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had terrible failures in unemployment insurance here in the United States, and that program just worked because they really, they worked out all of these kinks and tested and learned their way to something that really worked.
But just to clarify, they weren't adding on to the existing programs. They were creating a new program.
They were creating a new program that did what I believe 6 previous programs.
So which is a narrative I want to turn back to in this discussion. But the narrative is it might be characterized as reboot or reform. And I think in that situation, it sounded like it was a consolidation and a reboot. And a sort of a new,
it's somewhere between the two. I'm not quite sure how you would characterize it. Yeah, but between reboot and reform.
Okay.
But let me give you a contrasting example here in the U.S. It's a good story with sort of a somewhat happy ending. We had another failure, not related to the pandemic, when Congress ordered a quote-unquote modernization of the FAFSA system, the Federal Student Aid application, which resulted in sort of another mini healthcare.gov. Like, it just didn't work at all. And we're in a college campus. I don't need to tell you guys about the impact of this, but it was particularly harsh, for kids who were hoping to, especially first generation kids going to college. And it was actually very much a similar playbook. They brought in a team from outside who really did things in this test and learn way. And they had that skill set, they brought it in, and long story short, they got the FAFSA working quite well. The stats on it right now are fabulous. People are getting through it, and they actually have very high satisfaction rates. It is finally easier to use because they brought in this new, what we call the product operating model, of which test and learn is sort of the key piece. So that's great and all, but then along comes the Government Accountability Office and writes up a 62-page slap on the wrist of all the things that they have done wrong. And that is a list of the ways in which GAO is holding the Department of Education accountable to the old way of doing things.
Right.
Because they didn't check that box, and they missed that little box over here, and how dare they X. Here's the nice end of the story. Finally, you have the Department of Education pushing back instead of what I think so often happens in bureaucratic culture is okay, you got a bad GAO report, everyone hide under your desks and go on the defensive and geez, please don't ever do that again. Never experiment, never test and learn again. Instead, the Department of Education wrote back and said, you are holding us accountable to the wrong things. Here's what you said we should be doing. Here's what you should be evaluating us on. And you would have loved it, Philip, because it talks about the outcome. You should say, what are the goals that you're trying to set, and are you achieving those goals? Not, where is the 79-page documentation of your contractor performance? It's like, are kids getting through the system? What goals have you set? Are you actually achieving those goals? And it's the kind of change that we need to see in the oversight of these projects. Like, you cannot just change how these programs are developed. And I think there was too much of a focus on that by myself. I would even include over the past 15 years. You have to look at the front end and the back end of it. How are they funded? How are they conceived of? How are they staffed? Sure, then how are they developed? But then your oversight needs to match this new model. And that's why we have to move all of these pieces in concert.
Great. Okay, so we're going to circle back around to some of these issues. Josh, so you were in the Department of Defense for 10 years, twiddling your thumbs. Right, and sort of doing not much of anything.
He was very busy.
All of the public servants we've been talking about, I was just like wasting taxpayer dollars.
You were in it for the money.
Yeah, totally.
Yes, yeah. For the money. So what were the frustrations? What are the things that held you back from doing the job? And then following question is, how would you fix them?
Sure. My time in the Department of Defense were the most beloved years of my career. I loved being a public servant, and I loved the mission of the department. And most of all, I just have to say the camaraderie that you experienced with your fellow public servants about the work you were doing. And reading about the things that we were working on in the headlines every day it made you really feel like what we did mattered, and it was important. But I did not serve in uniform. Many of the men and women that I worked alongside either were currently in uniform or they had worked in uniform one time. And they often talked about how shared adversity created those bonds, whether it was boot camp experiences, or for me, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, almost everyone I worked with had combat experience. And so as a civil servant, our adversity that we combated every day was the sense of sclerosis and the bureaucracy. And it really was true that there were a lot of inside jokes and a lot of sort of commiserating and a shared sense of being in a small coterie of people who really were passionate about technology and about Silicon Valley's ideas. And we felt like we were a very small group battling the rest of this very large organization, actually the largest organization in the world. And there was this sense, and we were explicit about it at the time, for us, trying to modernize and reform the department felt like the Battle of Thermopylae every day to us. And so in some sense, we really did feel like there were many, many things that were holding us back. And you've heard about all these things today from the stage, and Jen is an expert at a lot of these things. And they had to do with the rules and the regulations about spending money and how money is allocated, the rules and the regulations and the procedures and the norms around procurement and acquisition and how companies are selected for contracts, what those contracts look like, the procedures that you need to go through to award those contracts, and then the increasing inevitability that those contracts would be protested. And you would have, I remember there were certain contracts I worked on where we spent years awarding those contracts, only to have them ultimately canceled and have to be shut down and started again. And then I would also say another category of this was personnel rules. I, for one thing, was a Schedule A in the government, not a civil servant in a traditional sense, because I was never able to successfully pass the vetting process in USA jobs at any time. And so I was only able to be hired on a temporary basis under a direct hiring authority. And then I had to leave government because that was a term-limited position, and that was one of the reasons I left. And so the inability to hire the people that you wanted to create your team, to shape your team, and to discipline your team and make those decisions were all the sorts of things that we were up against. And so that being said, if that was the end of the story, you would have an incredibly misleading impression of what life in government was like. Because for each of those things that was a source of friction or a frustration or a limitation, I have to tell you, there were so many examples of people finding ways to solve these problems. Either, the culture of getting the mission accomplished, being creative, thinking through how to solve these problems, whether it was through technology or was through reform or procedures. If we only focused on the barriers, it would not give you an accurate picture of all the remarkable things that people were doing to get things done. I'll just close by saying that the thing that, if you look at it in totality, that upset me was that we were charged with driving innovation in the Department of Defense, and our sense is that in order to achieve that goal, you had to be heroic.
Right.
There was not a sense that we were creating a pathway or a process or a set of incentives to encourage the behaviors that our elected leaders, our politically appointed leaders, were asking for. Rather, the people that were doing remarkable things in software, in data, in AI, in innovation in hardware, in new concepts, in new policies, they were all operating in ways that were unnatural to the expectations. They were taking personal career risk to do it. They were taking on an enormous emotional burden to be swimming upstream against that. And in order to get those things done, they had to be truly heroic. What we would like to do is reorganize the system, its norms, its rules, its procedures, and its laws, so that we actually are encouraging the behaviors that our leaders are saying that they want from the department.
Right. So as I'm sort of trying to filter what you said, there were 2 points of resistance. One would be a cultural resistance by, we call it the old guard, who didn't trust the new technology or something, right? That's an inter-organizational issue, political issue, if you will. And then there are the legal issues, federal acquisition regulations and such, that are very detailed and that are basically impossible to comply with and get something good done, because all of the different things you have to do for years, and then it gets overturned or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's true, but also not always true. So I'll give you an example of that. I think that the FAR is unfairly maligned.
I've never heard anyone stand up for the FAR.
I'm going to stand up for the FAR.
Federal acquisition regulations.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. So I will stand up for the FAR, but I will indict the JAGs and the attorneys.
Yeah.
So
okay, fair.
The thing is, if you are a very knowledgeable, expert contracting officer, acquisition officer, and you actually have read the FAR and you know what's in the FAR, and you are willing to tailor, which is permitted under Part 11, then you can do anything that you want to do with FAR-based contracting. But in order to do it, you need to have a warrant officer and attorneys and procurement and acquisition officials and an entire network of people around you willing to let you do what is actually in the FAR. So one of the great examples of this is Special Operations Command, which is known in all of our defense circles and even in the popular sort of mythology of Hollywood as having the coolest toys. One of my friends and mentors and someone that that we both worked with was a gentleman named Hondo Gertz, who at that time was part of one element, a piece of the Special Operations Command sort of technology innovation team. And he later became the Undersecretary of the Navy as his career progressed. But anyway, Hondo was very fond of pointing out, yes, I get to do the coolest stuff, and I have the coolest stuff. But it's not because I don't use the FAR. I do everything that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they can do, but I'm willing to tailor and do those things. And why was he willing to do that? Well, the culture of Special Operations Command is completely different than the culture of the General Purpose Force. For one thing, you are usually double or triple selected to become a member of the Special Operations community. So we put an enormous amount of trust and confidence in the judgment. This is to your point, because I listened to you all day. The trust and the judgment in these special operators. And so because we trust their judgment, because we know them to be elite and to be proven, we allow them to do things that we don't allow other parts of the military to do. But the law is the same. Another quick example, and I'll mention this because it is very local to Stanford. It's in this neighborhood. When you don't want to use the Federal Acquisition Regulation, you can use something called an Other Transaction Authority, which is a government permission that has existed for 60 years that was given to NASA and DoD and some other agencies as well to use other transaction authorities, which means you get a get out of jail free card. You don't have to use the FAR. But even though the other transaction authorities existed for the entire period of time, they only started to be used for non-FAR-based contracting in order to attract Silicon Valley companies by the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which is like mere steps from the Stanford campus. Now, the reason why this happened had nothing to do with the law. It had everything to do with norms. It was because my friend Lauren came up with something called a commercial services opening, which did not require an authority from Congress, and it did not require a change to the law. They came up with a set of norms and procedures for how to use other transaction authorities in order to get to what we at that time called non-traditional companies. So it's not enough to be given an authority by Congress. You have to have a concept of operations of how to employ it and repeat it and scale it. And so they started to have their own acquisition officers who they specially trained, who were led by a smaller team, and that team encouraged them to take more risk. So it's not the law or even the authorities. In fact, the Senate Armed Services Committee gave DoD so many new authorities for hiring, for acquisition, for procurement, for everything, that the department can't even adopt all of the special permissions they were given in order to go faster in great power competition. Because again, the bottleneck isn't the law or the authorities. The bottleneck is training the workforce in how to use them, encouraging them to use them, giving them permission to use them, giving them budget and resources to use them. It's not the law that's in the way as much as all of the things that are required to deliver results.
You said there was there were things that you would change, that people had to be heroic when they did certain things. So that's a little bit at odds with the description you just had. So what would you change? How should decisions be made in procurement in the area that you built?
Sure. So I'll give you a great example of something that I would change. And I think we've seen that it started to change and it's working better. So it's proof that this is the right way to go about it. So for the first 5 years that the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental existed, where they were using the other transaction authorities and they were getting support from Congress, giving them gradually more and more authorities and more flexibility, and they were building up their workforce of people that knew how to use these tools, and they developed these processes. During that entire period of time, their budget was like infinitesimally tiny rounding error in the defense budget. So they didn't actually have enough resources to deliver results, but they were being held accountable for delivering better than average performance. So we were holding them to a much higher standard, and we were inspecting them to a much higher standard, and they had to spend so much time defending and explaining what they were doing because they were doing it differently. But the reason that they weren't delivering the results that people were asking for is because they didn't have enough resources. So one of the things that is really great is that recently they 10x'd the size of their budget from about 100 million to about $1 billion. And what we saw is as soon as they had enough resources to go from a scarcity mindset to a mindset of possibilities, then all of a sudden the dynamics of how they interacted with the combatant commands changed. So what we saw was a very dramatic increase in the transition rate once they had a budget. And it had nothing to do with the judgments they were making or the choices they were making. It changed the game theory of the end users, because it used to be that if you were a combatant commander and you were responsible for what we called a fight tonight scenario, you did not really want to experiment with a prototype that you did not believe you could take to what we call production, because you didn't believe that you would actually be able to use anything. So even if the Defense Innovation Unit was finding an incredible startup that had an amazing technology and they were able to actually prove the technology could work, they were failing at transitioning it. But it turns out the failure to transition had less to do with the quality of the technology or its usefulness for what I call product mission fit. It had to do with the fact that they were so small and so broke that no commanders wanted to work with them. Once they had additional influence, political power, a little bit more resources, a little bit more budget, then immediately you saw a greater uptake of what they do. And now I would say the Defense Innovation Unit is a lot more powerful, a lot more influential, and it's the cause and effect arrows were in the wrong direction. People think, oh, they're more powerful, more influential when they have budget. Actually, it's the reverse. Giving them a budget gave them status. So that's what I would do. I would say instead of having a system where first of all, we allocate the entire defense program 100%. Every dollar, every penny is accounted for. There's no margin. Right. There's no flexibility fund. And everything is programmed out into the penny. Instead, I would divide that whole budget, which is currently divided into about 1,200 program elements, into what it was after World War II, which is, let's say, divided into 50 program elements. And that would go from creating something that is so marginalized in terms of incremental decision and discretion to people that everyone have to manage a portfolio. And by doing that, you go from the scarcity mindset to more of an abundance mindset, and you are able to hold back a reserve to have discretion, and you're able to make more winners the way we made the Defense Innovation Unit a winner.
Great, okay. So when we're talking about renewal of government in America, government is many different things, obviously. And so we were just talking about the internal operations of how you buy goods in the Defense Department, and Jennifer's focused on how to modernize government with using IT and modern systems and the problems of hiring people and stuff. But government also obviously interacts with the citizens in a variety of ways that affects how our society works. And one of the ways is that it gives permits for infrastructure. And I worked on a bunch of infrastructure permitting reforms in Congress. They passed them, page limits on environmental reviews, time limits. They've made no difference. And the reason they've made no difference is because when you have a body of law and regulation that's 150 million words, even if it says you've got to do it in 2 years, there'll be another law that's completely inconsistent that says you must do all these studies and stuff, which you can't do within 2 years. So you have this kind of, if you put AI into the body of federal law, it would short circuit or have a nervous breakdown or something because there'd be all these things that don't fit because they weren't built to match. It was just it's like quicksand. It's an equation, to mix a metaphor. It's an accretion of stuff. So Dan Wong lived 6 years in China, where he was born. He went back for 6 years voluntarily, I think. Right?
Yes.
Right. Good. And again, he's written this wonderful book called Breakneck, which I would encourage you to buy 10 copies of. And so, how were decisions made in China? How well do they work in the, especially the public-facing, infrastructure decisions and such?
Yeah, so I feel like I've spent 6 years living in a government culture that was a little bit too much can do, and frankly, I wish that the Chinese were a little bit more can't do relative to this country. But after spending 6 years as a technology analyst in China, living between first Hong Kong, then Beijing, and then Shanghai, I think it is really ripe for me to come over to California and make a few contrasts between what I saw in China as well as what I see in California. We've already brought up the example of California high-speed rail in the previous panel, and I think we cannot speak enough of California high-speed rail given how much of a delay and disaster I think it looks. So I want to strike up a contrast between California high-speed rail on the one hand and China's first high-speed rail line between Beijing and Shanghai on the other. So 2008 was a very important year for high-speed rail in both countries. In 2008, the voters in California approved a referendum saying that California shall have high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and it was meant to be completed in the year 2020. And in 2008, China actually started building its first high-speed rail line between Beijing and Shanghai. And just by coincidence, the California high-speed rail and the Chinese high-speed rail system are both about the same length. I think it's about something like 800 miles. And here is where the similarities really end. So, what has happened in California? Well, it is the year 2025. How many people have ridden California high-speed rail? The answer, of course, is 0. The first stretch of California high-speed rail is supposed to finish between the years 2030 to 2033, connecting the cities of Bakersfield and Merced, which are not especially close to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And right now, the cost estimate for, I believe, the first stretch of that segment is meant to be $126 billion. So by contrast, in China, they started building their first high-speed rail line in 2008. 3 years later, they completed it between Beijing and Shanghai. This is a much denser area that they had to negotiate a lot of property rights through. The stated cost by by official media is that Chinese high-speed rail took about $40 billion to complete this line. And according to state media, within the first decade of operation, this line completed about 1.4 billion passenger trips. And so, one contrast I see between the Chinese state media when it talks about its own high-speed rail is that it focused on the outcome of how many people it had actually been able to move. Whenever I see a press release from California high-speed rail, it is about the number of high-paying union jobs this line has created, which is a procedural, it's a process outcome, right? They're just bragging about the number of jobs it's created rather than the number of people it has really been able to move. And so, one of these questions I sort of have, sitting here in California is, where's the level of accountability that this line is just really dragging out? I would be pretty surprised if 3 decades after the referendum, any of us would be able to ride on this rail from San Francisco down to Los Angeles. Why is there so little accountability? How many heads have rolled here at this transit authority? Why has not a whole new team been put in? And where is Governor Gavin at these ribbon cutting ceremonies? Whether that is something like a segment of the rail or other California building successes. Perhaps that's the $1.7 million public toilet. Perhaps that is the adding the bus lane to Van Ness Avenue, which took about 20 years from planning to completion to add a bus lane to one avenue. And so here's where I think the comparison between the US and China is that if you are a Chinese person living in the cities, let's say, your demands would be something like more parks, cleaner air, more subway stations. If you're living in the Chinese countryside, they would be getting new highways, new sorts of bridges, perhaps a high-speed rail network that connects the cities into the interior, the coasts into the interior. And if you're a Chinese resident and you are getting a lot of these sort of things, you previously didn't have a subway line, now you do. You previously didn't have parks, now you do. Given that the past has looked pretty good, you also also expect the future to be better. And so I think this sort of just raw physical dynamism is part of the Communist Party's ability to build political resilience also for itself. And I think this is part of the reason that consent to the governed in China is still relatively strong, because they feel that their lives are constantly getting better in front of them. Now, a provocation I want to offer, why has there been relatively little accountability here in California, is that, at a first approximation, perhaps, California does not look like a big failure. The west coast of the United States is the only zone in the world that has created several companies worth over trillions of dollars. And so, Apple, Google, Nvidia are now, $3 to $4 trillion worth companies. And so, this is, I think, something that Americans can rightfully point to with pride to say that the U.S. has created this, Europeans and Chinese have not. And I think that is a valid rebuttal, but I also fear that these sort of very profitable companies has occluded and masked some of these broader weaknesses in the United States. I think a lot about how the manufacturing base has not distinguished itself very well in the last few years, arguably few decades. If we take a look at a lot of American apex manufacturers, whether that is Intel or Boeing or Detroit or Tesla, all of them have run into some sort of a problem, and they all seem to be quite disconnected. And so, within the apex manufacturers, it has not looked tremendously well. In the early days of COVID, which Philip Zelikow has studied so much, a lot of the early manufacturers did not make relatively simple products like masks and cotton swabs, in part because of Chinese competition, but in part because they couldn't retool very effectively. In the sort of defense industrial base areas that Josh spent so much time looking at, the U.S. has not been able to rebuild its munitions stockpile very quickly, and this is after it sent a lot to Ukraine in its self-defense against Russia. For the U.S., every category of naval ships is behind schedule by between 18 months to 5 years, there's just a lot of these strange failures with the American industrial base. And I think this is where I also want to challenge a little bit this idea that America is doing so well because it has these trillion-dollar companies. I think a lot about this comparison between Apple, which is, last I checked, has a market cap of about $3.5 trillion, along with a company called Xiaomi in China, which is also a smartphone maker, also makes a range of other products. Last I checked, its market value was about $200 billion. So that's about a 15x difference between Apple and Xiaomi. Apple, about 10 years ago, said that it was going to investigate whether it was going to be able to build an electric vehicle. After 10 years of debate, it threw up its hands and said, no, we're not going to try to build an EV. Xiaomi, by contrast, 5 years ago, declared that we are going to make electric vehicles. The founder stated publicly on stage, I'm going to do this. This is going to be my last great entrepreneurial venture. He committed $10 billion to building electric vehicles. 4 years later, Xiaomi's electric vehicles have rolled off the line. They're really selling a lot. They keep raising their production targets. Its first vehicle set a speed record in this German racing course called Nürburgring, which is a notoriously difficult race, and it beat some of these incumbents like BMW and Porsche, which typically tends to win these sort of races. And so, 15x difference in valuation between Apple and Xiaomi. Which company would you prefer? Well, I think I would prefer Xiaomi, which says it's going to enter a major industry and actually managed to do it, and in part because it had all of this engineering expertise in order to do everything well. Now, I think the final point I'll land on is that I think there are problems to having an overcompetent state. I spent the entirety of zero COVID in China. The first act of zero COVID in China was a lot of political rage that another respiratory virus was circulating in China, the second in 20 years after SARS, in part because the political system covered up a lot of the news of the virus and detained some medical whistleblowers. The second act was that China managed to control COVID really well, going above and beyond WHO recommendations to have contact tracing in place, have centralized quarantine systems in place, really to block a lot of travel into China. And then the third act was a complete disaster in which they try to impose what I describe in my book as the greatest lockdown ever attempted in the history of humanity, in which in the year 2022, in China's largest city, 25 million people in Shanghai were unable to leave their apartment compounds over the course of 8 to 10 weeks. And so this is where they were really able to do something that the United States, I think, has no capacity to do. And they had both the competence and the capacity to enforce these sort of lockdowns. That was very, very strange. I also spent quite a lot of time in my book writing about the one-child policy, in which over 35 years, according to China's own official data, China conducted about 320 million abortions throughout mostly the countryside, and then sterilized 100 million women and 20 million men. And so, this is just the sort of country that is able to do these sort of very strange things that inflict disasters upon the population. The final point I'll make is that what I would really love is for the U.S. to become, let's say, 20% more engineering focused, so that it is able to, fix a lot of its problems with homes, with mass transit, with building more clean technology. Having a little bit more, 20% more Robert Moses, I think would be a good ratio. And what I would really love is for the United States, for China to become 50% more lawyerly, and to be much more like the U.S., to have some sort of procedures in place, so that you're able to resist something like the one-child policy. What I think would be great is if the Communist Party could actually respect individual freedoms, to stop strangling the creative impulses of the people, and fundamentally just to leave people alone for a little bit. And that is my prescription for American government and global peace.
So there's the ability of the party to make choices and huge investments in the 15 high-speed rail lines now, or whatever it is, and such, and to the stories about forced abortions and such are truly. I could barely finish those chapters. They were incredibly upsetting. How brutal the party was. The party's willing to accept brutality and lots of mistakes. So lots of money they spent, on all those huge housing projects, right? Nobody lives in them and stuff, and housing companies going bankrupt and, whatever. So there are lots of mistakes that go along with the successes. And I think, most people would probably agree with you that there's maybe a happy median here. But in each of the things we've talked about here, which is defense, at least part of defense, modernizing government and building infrastructure, all those things are problems in our society, but they're not the only problems. And so while we do have these incredibly successful companies, many located here, there's a sense that Americans feel that the future won't be brighter. 2/3 of Americans think that the government doesn't work and needs major overhaul. That there's a sense of gloom about the future, as if these very successful companies in the Valley and elsewhere are like the flowers in the last full bloom of a dying bush or something. And so if you look at schools, Rick Hanishek's work on schools showing a really sharp decline in student achievement, not just because of COVID, but starting before COVID and continuing in America. These declines, something like 35% of 8th graders can't even perform at basic level, which means they won't be able to hold jobs. And so we're having this, instead of an inspiring society where the future is brighter, we have these legacy systems, a Congress that's inert. There are lots of problems here, the education system, that require a sense of renewal of how government works. And so before we open up the questions, I want to challenge all of you, looking at it beyond your own immediate experience and stuff. What do you think America needs now? Do we need a narrative for a spring cleaning, a kind of a reboot, a re-empowerment? I mean, if you were trying to get Americans engaged behind the idea of making government work, renewing government, making it work. What would that look like?
I have very strong views about this. So,
would you like to talk about it?
I would like to talk about it. So I think I spent my last 5 years in the department trying to build a bridge between Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense, and I've spent the last 5 years at Google working on the same bridge from the other shore. And there's a lot of things that Americans love about the spirit of entrepreneurship and the promise of technology. And it was a super interesting moment. I don't remember the exact date or statistic, but a few years ago where you polled young people about who they looked up to the most. And it used to be rock stars and athletes, and now it's entrepreneurs. So there's an excitement about technology and an excitement about entrepreneurship. But the big difference between my coworkers who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and were willing to risk their lives for their fellow countrymen, and more importantly for the values and the beliefs and the ideals behind it, and the venture capital backed, companies that have made this part of America so powerful to the point that that you were just making, is virtue. And there was a young man, I think his name was Robert, who was sitting right there, who asked Scott Cooper this question about it. And that young man inspired me more than anything else. What I see as someone sort of is still kind of in the middle of my career, but have a nonprofit organization that has for the last 20 years been encouraging young people to join public service and live great and giving lives of purpose, is a crisis of idealism. And when I was in my 20s, I was surrounded by young people who all chose to come to Washington, D.C. because they all believed that if you wanted to have a significant and important life, you moved to Washington, D.C. to work on hard, important problems. Whether they were wanting to join government, or they were going to a nonprofit organization, or they were going to study, they all were incredibly inspired by the idea that America was a leader in the world that could make things better, and that they wanted to have a life making things better. And the way that you did that was you infused your institutions with virtues. And whether it is the remaking of our business institutions or it's the remaking of our government institutions, the rallying cry should not be to make America great again. It should make America good again. When you think of the mythology that we tell ourselves about the stories of what it means to be an American exceptionalism, was a version of America that defeated fascism, defeated polio, defeated hunger, defeated all of these things because we were good. Not because we were powerful or because we were rich, but because we were good. And when we hear the stories that make us cringe about what your description of this hyper-effective and hyper-efficient other power in the world, what they are not attempting to do really is present themselves as being virtuous. They are presenting themselves, and you're an expert, more as a question of sovereignty and independence. And when I think Americans are excited about America is when they see themselves as leaders, and that's what I would love to see us do a lot more of.
Okay. So, just because I read it, the first 40 pages of this book I just published, Striving Can Do, talks about the values of post-60s liberalism that have undermined virtue in our society. The inability to, quote, be judgmental. The subjective judgment is somehow not valid, that you have to be able to prove by objective facts what's right and wrong. That morality is just your point of view. And so if you look at any organization, a Department of Defense Department, any good school, any good organization, it has values and standards that are enforced by the people in charge. And if the people are good and they uphold those values, there's an incredible web of mutual trust, and it strives forward. Every good school has this, every single good school. And they do it in different ways. But they believe in themselves and they believe in their values. And the relativism of post-60s, which I write about in this book, the relativism of post-60s legal structures and the whole idea of looking at disputes as a matter of your individual rights. Well, what about the rights of the person you don't like? I mean, who has a different point of view? I mean, freedom's not about getting what you want. It's about convincing other people that you're good at what you do and you're a good person or whatever. And so the modern idea, the old idea of rights was rights against coercion by the state. The modern idea of rights is rights against the people you work with. It's this crazy kind of inversion of legal power against your supervisor.
It's easy to agree with that, but there also has to be a place for compassion.
If you have a firm where people are mean-spirited and they're not nice, that firm's not going to have mutual trust either. You know, morality is not a checklist, right? Emerson said, character is cumulative. You know, it's yes. I mean, if you have a mean-spirited firm, it's going to be a lousy organization. And I'm not saying do whatever you want and be mean. It's just saying that there's a place for people to want to go to, and if you want to work in government, start attracting government. Give people real responsibility, like you had in the Defense Department. Who wants to go and be a paper pusher for life? That's not the striving that America was built on, right? You want to give people real responsibility to run the classroom, to run the department, you know, and like Jen did. I mean, Jen goes in the White House and fixes this complete mess, right?
Oh, I think you're missing the point. Both Josh and I went into government and felt like you were carving Mount Rushmore with a teaspoon.
Right.
It's actually very hard to have authority in government. And this, I mean, to the extent that you and Mark and others are talking about sort of the vision of government that we developed in the 60s of it being overbearing and making too many decisions, I mean, for good reason, right? I mean, that we don't want another Moses, but the sense is that you go into government and you have all this power, and the reality is you go into government and you feel you have absolutely no power.
That's what Frank was saying.
And anything you do is because you had to hack around the system. I mean, you had to be heroic, right?
Yeah.
To what Josh said. But I do think that is about, I mean, I think we are in a moment of change, not just because of DOGE, not just because of budget cuts, not just because of AI, but because of all of these things put together, where, you know, I like the notion of moral good, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely with you, but I think we had a theory of change in the past, say 15 years that I've been working on this, which is, we will be able to make change without pissing anybody off. Like, we'll be able to reform this system, but everyone will still be happy and nobody will be upset.
What?
And like, it doesn't work that way. You know, the line, you know, you can't make an omelet if you don't break some eggs, right? Like, we were trying to do that. We were trying to make an omelet without it breaking any eggs for a variety of different reasons. Now, those eggs are broken and more are going to be broken. And what we need to do with that now is make the freaking omelet.
Right. But just applying that to schools, a university is not good if 80% of the grades are A's. Right. It's funny. A school, you don't learn by being happy. You learn by failure. All of us. We learn by failure. We make mistakes. We pick ourselves up. There's a lot of learning on that. You know, sort of. Thomas Edison, you know, all the people talking about there ain't no rules around here. We got, you know, trying to get something done. So there's a sense of people collaborating and being together in a mission. Good, right? That our pluralistic society. We didn't have a society where everybody got along. We had a society where people left each other to be with people like themselves. Mormons go to Utah, the Hasidic Jews go to Brooklyn, the techies come to Palo Alto. There are all these communities that work really great together, and they form strong bonds, and Robert Putnam's written about that. But I agree with Josh that we have to create a mechanism, but it includes a mechanism for action as well as a mechanism for moral aspiration.
Absolutely. But one of the things that worries me about AI and social media and these things is the ability to not only segment ourselves by moving to Utah for people that share our religious beliefs, but being able to create atomized echo chambers of only surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us and bifurcating our sources of news and information. And that right. World of segmentation terrifies me. Like, I believe that we have never than this at this moment needed more people to say, I want to collaborate with people I don't agree with in order to make us competent as a society, to level ourselves up.
Right.
And I do worry a little bit about striking the balance in the correct way as we imagine what a future society would look like, because I do think it's incredibly important to protect the rights of minorities. And it seems to have gotten away from us a little bit, but we're also living through a period of intense backlash now against some of the sort of excesses of overfocus on individual rights, and there's got to be a way to strike a balance. And again, the purpose of this is about government competence. I think ultimately the reason that we have this lost faith in government gets back to something that Jen had said, which is that people are having consumer experiences that so vastly outperform their government experiences, and it's creating a massive erosion of trust. And I think you point out in your exposition here is, and you talked about it in contrast to your experience with people in China, what they want from their government is the ability to get things done and make their life better. And when they feel like they are losing trust in institutions and they're more divided from their neighbors, and the government is telling them how much, denigrating their government, denigrating public service and public servants, it contributes to a general sense that we've fallen off of our ability to do the right thing. And this sense of we can't afford to invest in our communities, we can't afford to invest in our government, we can't afford to invest in these things. And I actually feel the opposite is true. Like we are absolutely remarkable, exceptional, and deeply good people, capable of doing remarkable, extraordinary accomplishments, and our government should be leading us to those accomplishments.
Right. Okay, that's a great way to go to questions from the audience. Yes, right here.
Thank you. As I've been listening to the ARCs over the last 3 sessions, one thing that just keeps jumping up into the front of my mind is, do we have the right upper educational model to facilitate the change that we're looking for? So we have a model where the investment is actually not achievable for most anymore. A lot of people cannot justify even getting a bachelor's degree. And those that can, most of them view it as a lifetime investment. But I think we are actually well past the point where people realize that one set of training right after high school is not going to carry you through the skills that you need until you're age 65 to stay in whatever, whether it's private sector or public sector. I tell my kids, you're probably going to have to retrain twice. I think education missed the generation that had to retrain. I think those people are stuck. Many of them are stuck in government right now. We don't have an educational system that's priced or even structured to facilitate the retraining that the technology is going to bring us, like it or not. And I envision something like micro-certification. So if what you need to do a better job is just COBOL, that's not 4 years. That's maybe, 9 months, depending on how you structure it. So here we are at Stanford, one of the most premier educational institutions in the world, which benefits from exactly what's driving some of the problems in government. They like stability, they like reliability, the 4-year degree, the master's program, the PhD, plus continuing education and executive education programs. Those are the offerings. What opportunities exist within upper educational institutions and the government saying, we want to work with you to retain institutional knowledge and then also allow our employees to pick up skills along the way so we don't end up having to fire them all through a Doge effort.
Right.
I haven't heard any talk about this today, and I'm wondering whether it's in the back of your minds as well.
There's some really smart people at Hoover who've talked today, Mackie and Rick Hanishek and others, talking about the absolutely precondition of focusing on early education and making reintroducing a sense of values and energy and culture so that people have the DNA to retrain. They will have to retrain. So you need to have people who go to school and learn techniques about how to learn, right? And at school, instead we have sort of not very good schools. I was on a not-for-profit public survey company that studied why community colleges were so lousy. And they were just going through the motions. They didn't really talk to the students about what their real interests were. They weren't practical, and so the students would incur all this debt and take these arbitrary courses, often from for-profit colleges that just wanted to make money off of them, and then they end up saddled with these loans and have no prospects. So we've gotten sloppy in our education system. There are many ways to be a good citizen, and there are many trades as well as things that don't require college education that require real skill and requires the ability to retrain. But we need to have the DNA in our education system to, like in Europe, like Austria and Switzerland, they have apprenticeship programs. Job training programs don't work in the abstract in general. They work when they're connected to particular employers. And so apprenticeship programs are really important because then the person knows if they learn how to do this, they'll get hired at the end of the job. It's not just going to a class and looking at a blackboard or whatever. So this Decadence or Renewal requires us to reinvigorate pride and values in the things that you're talking about. And all the problems you mentioned are real.
How does China do it?
They make a lot of kids study engineering, whether or not they want to. There is just a lot more forcible STEM training. I think that is very real. My parents were of a generation in which they had no choice to study whatever they did. My mom studied to train as a thermal engineer, not because she wanted to, but because the state said your test scores are this high, therefore you're going to go be a coal miner, and that was a very strange thing that they were doing. And to some extent, right now there is still quite a lot of coercion to say go study these different aspects because these different streams because that is the best thing to do.
And how rigorous are the schools?
I think my sense I get from reading the research is that the average universities are probably not all that distinguished, but among the highest caliber universities, they seem to train students very, very well. And based on what we see from a lot of these extremely well compensated AI engineers, some of whom have been poached to Silicon Valley, many of them have come out of China's top university programs. And so within the elites, it seems to be quite good.
Right. Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Harry Kaplan. I'm a senior here at Stanford. And my question was to Josh's remarks on like the atomization of like echo chambers and public spaces. And as a student here, you know, my classmates have very, very rarely like faced adversity. Like we have all straight A's. There is prolific cheating across campus in a lot of the academic departments. And there's a lot of lack of respect for, I think, authority figures, for professors. You know, how do we get back to this place where we break down the atomization and get to kind of a less of the morally relativistic view post-60s and more to like universal, you know, virtue, goodness. Like as a student myself, I don't see that path. You know, I was wondering if you guys see that path.
I have a question for you before you give the microphone up. Who are your role models? Or when you think of your I don't want to put you on the spot, you think of your peers, right? Like, from whom do you think they're getting that inculcation of what is an appropriate way to live your life as a woman or a man in the world? Like where are they getting that from?
Well, for myself, I go to my rabbi, but for my classmates, I think they get it from each other, is the sense of competition. And rather than being a competition to build up to something great, it's a competition of, you know, who can undercut, who can, you know, navigate the path savvily in whichever way. And it oftentimes leads to the opposite of what we should be striving for.
You know, my response is a free society is a marketplace. And it should be a marketplace of character as well as everything else. And I was really upset by the whole Claudine Gay thing at Harvard. And so I wrote an essay, spent 6 weeks writing an essay about why I was so upset, knowing that I would never publish it, because I'm not the kind of guy who could publish something like that. You know, I've had every privilege in my life and everything. So but what I landed on was that what I view as the loss of rigor, you know, in higher ed, particularly at the best schools like Stanford, in part stems from a disempowerment of the professors to judge people based on their expert judgment. I mean, who are they to judge that your writing is no good or whatever? You can grade a science test because the answers are right or wrong. But for the humanities and the social sciences and even a lot of other courses that are quasi-scientific, what's good or not requires value judgments. And the professors I know, don't feel empowered to do that. They feel they'll be attacked, or they're not being fair, and they'll be called on the carpet for doing it. I like the Cooper's idea of actually having like a curve, for federal employees, have a, so that only a certain percentage can be truly excellent, and maybe that's one way to restore it. But you also have to restore, I think, the authority of the people whose lives are dedicated to a particular discipline to make their judgments about what's good and not. Because if you don't, then all of a sudden it just sinks to the bottom.
There's a lot of discussion on this panel on good character and virtue. And I'm reacting a little bit. I'm thinking about that, and I think, changing the moral character of a nation sounds kind of difficult. And I have a little bit more modest of a goal. I mean, I'm thinking about, where in the examples that we have about can-do cultures, one is Silicon Valley, the other is China. These two places don't scream excellent moral virtue at all points to me. And I think, maybe just a more modest goal is I have a little bit more of a hope in technocracy and in making things better. If we loosen up some of these zoning laws to have a few more homes being able to be built in these very expensive places, that perhaps also triggers a little bit more commerce around these areas. People like having more neighbors, and maybe we can have just a simple virtuous loop of loosening some of these things, improving people's lives around them. There are places in America that do build quite a lot. These include places like Austin, Texas, parts of Utah, where people just seem much more optimistic than San Francisco or the Bay Area in some ways, right? So maybe we don't need to change the moral character. Maybe we can just do a few simple technocratic reforms, get us a little bit better to renewal.
Well, let me just push back on that. So California, a one-bedroom affordable housing unit, subsidized housing in California, costs roughly $750,000. A same-size unit, market-priced unit, so making profit, in Texas, in Dallas, will cost one-third that. It's $250,000. So there is a kind of a spring. So what I would submit is that I don't think the morality and the effectiveness are at all inconsistent. I think you want to be in a society, in a place where you can wake up in the morning, make a difference, and you're not constantly being held back by what seem to be kind of random vestigial bureaucracy and rules that nobody's looked at. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day. Our regulatory system is really a form of central planning. It's, you have to do this, you have to do that, except that the planners are dead. So America's run by dead central planners, the people who wrote rules, 50 years ago or something. So my sense is that we might stimulate a really interesting public debate about all these issues if we created a kind of spring cleaning narrative, where you say go area by area. I'm talking about creating one-page templates that people can then argue over about how to simplify healthcare or, whatever.
I'll just say I like the idea of spring cleaning. And to try to tie in a little bit this sort of pessimism around Stanford and the culture, like we are at a place, we are at a moment in time when suddenly tools are available that were not available before for the kind of spring cleaning that you're talking about. That I'm not a techno-optimist, I really never have been, but I find myself going, wait a minute, we couldn't do it before. If you needed to take how many pages of regulation should cover unemployment insurance, right? It's a program that's supposed to give you a certain amount of money for a certain number of weeks under certain circumstances when you lose your job. But it's 7,119 pages right now. if you wanted to take that down to whatever number of pages you think it is, good luck until today, because we have LLMs that can ingest all of that and help us sort it through in a ways that just had gotten literally like out of the ability of human control. And so we're at this particular moment and so in time, and we're in a particular place where like the Reg Lab here at Stanford is at the cutting edge of doing that work. And yeah, I don't think that's seen broadly as an incredible opportunity that could have huge, impact on the society that we live in and the sense of frustration with these sclerotic institutions. But I think it is, and I just wish we were more. Yes, there's a lot going on in terms of, the negative impacts of AI and social media, and a very chaotic world. But I can be equally sort of pulled down by all of those things. But we do suddenly have the clarity about the problem and the tools to actually solve it. And I will say, much more bipartisan or multi-partisan or whatever, or nonpartisan support for the need to solve it than we've ever had before.
Right, and we have the disruption. And one of the things people haven't talked about with AI is one of the reasons we have all these rules and red tape is nobody trusts anybody to make a decision. One thing AI could be really useful at is a kind of a check and balance. It can be a kind of accountability tool. We're going to try this. Oh, the AI says that. It's just not making the decisions, but actually, like, for example, for pre-approvals for medical care, you could have much less red tape in getting healthcare services by letting AI identify outliers.
I would agree with you on that. I think one thing we have to be very cautious of in government, I remember the first time, this was a couple years ago, and it was like, okay, now AI can make decisions about who to hire. And there was a lot of interest in this. And I was like, that is just another expression of a core dysfunction, which was nobody wants to make a decision. And if you're like, okay, now I'm going to let AI make the decision. Well, first of all the people the reason people didn't want to make the hiring decision in the first place is because they were going to get criticized or sued or something for making a decision that somebody didn't agree with, right? Well, if you say, well, AI made it, the same people are going to make the same criticisms of the AI. It just displaces the problem.
I didn't say make the decision.
No, I know.
I said check a decision.
No, I agree. I think they can be very useful in that regard. What I want to say is, like, we should not let that we already have a core dysfunction in government about an unwillingness to make and stand by decisions that may be quote unquote unpopular, by which we mean one person doesn't like them. We need to fix that and not try to have, we cannot, no amount of technology will solve that problem.
I agree. Josh?
So interesting is the studies show is that there's one thing that is able to make better judgments or better decisions or higher performance than either systems that are run by humans or systems run by artificial intelligence, and that is the artful collaboration between humans and machines. And that those hybrid systems, at least at this point in time, outperforming systems that have one or the other. And the big irony in this is that, like, one of the main ideas about why you would spend so much money, to your point, ma'am, to send your kids to Stanford was that Stanford was the ideal place to teach your children how to become software engineers so they get these $1 million a year jobs. It turns out like that was misleading, because the first people to be replaced by AI are going to be software engineers. And it turns out that the best use of an institution like Stanford for America and for the world is to teach humanistic values and a liberal arts education, to imbue humans with the judgment and the morality to know when to use AI systems and how best to use those systems and how to design those systems. And so this very dystopian depiction of Stanford by this gentleman of a school with, great inflation, rampant cheating, kids trying to stab each other in the back, to try to get a better job is deeply concerning to me for the reasons is that I genuinely believe Stanford is the place where a lot of these technologies will continue to be created and where a lot of these companies will continue to recruit, because this is such a remarkable institution with such a venerated history. And so I really think that whether we think it's the responsibility of parents or teachers, it's certainly not peers. Someone has to be doing the things that Condoleezza Rice and Philip Zelikow have been saying on stage today, to say that it's not just the responsibility of the Hoover Institution, but it's the responsibility of all of Stanford and all of higher education to develop a pipeline of deeply moral beings who understand the most important thing about citizenship, which is that it's about sacrifice. If you think about all of the greatest American presidents and what they said to Americans, they all said, whether it was Ben Franklin or it was Theodore Roosevelt or it was John F. Kennedy, they all talked to young people about the price of citizenship in a great country is sacrifices.
Right.
And one of the things I see the least of in the young people that I coach and mentor is any sense at all of the willingness to make sacrifice. What they really want is what their parents taught them to expect, which is comfort. Intellectual comfort, physical comfort, and emotional comfort. That will be the undoing of America. So the most important thing we need to ask all these students is, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to have a great life?
Okay, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the panel. That's a perfectly good way to end. I just want to note, having a functioning government is important to that.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
fine. Great.
Should bring it
Thank
back.
And I want to thank the audience. Some of you have been patient and enjoying all three of our panels today. I do think it's worth, in closing, to notice Jen Paulka's comment that this is not going to be easy, and there's going to be a fight. You can decide what the issue is on which you pick the fight. Let's suppose that tomorrow someone said, you know what, we're going to start with this one thing. We're going to eliminate a private right of legal action under the National Environmental Protection Act. You know, it's just that one thing. Or we're going to limit it in the following way that Diego Zambrano has told us could work. And maybe you have a bill that has 2 or 3 of these things that are high leverage illustrations of where you begin that then become a battleground for an agenda. And boy, that's not going to be a fight. But you can see that there's an enormous political agenda here in a way about ideas advancing freedom, actually freedom to govern capably, whatever government it is you want. And we need an agenda that a lot of people coalesce around to try to press for that freedom. And I think there are progressives and conservatives who will join that fight and change the way we think of this in party terms. And so these panels today, the panel last night, I think have helped at least inform me about the different approaches and ideas that people are bringing to this agenda. And so thank you very much for joining and listening and sharing the education here. Good day for Stanford. Thank you.